Welcome, sleepless spirit. I'm your storyteller tonight, here to guide you gently into the shadows of slumber, where dreams take over and worries fade away. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more bedtime tales, whispered just for you. Let me know in the comments, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it as you listen tonight? And if there's a story you've been longing to hear, something spooky, something comforting, tell me. I'm always listening. Now, tuck yourself in. Let the darkness wrap around you like a warm blanket. It's time to let go and drift into the story. Precisely 3:17 a.m. Jake, a truck driver, was alone in his cab. He drove through the Nevada desert when he heard something that made his blood freeze. His own voice calling for assistance over the CB radio from a place he had never been touched. His radio in hours. The voice on the frequency was pleading with someone to locate his body before they returned, mentioning a cargo he had never hauled and describing non-existent landmarks. When Jake attempted to reply, his radio died, but the transmission persisted on all the frequencies he tried. 3 days later, police discovered, and every night at 3:17 a.m., Jake was still driving and alive, hearing his own desperate screams through the static, even though the abandoned truck matched Jake's description and was located at the precise coordinates his other voice had provided. If you've ever had an experience at precisely 3:17 a.m., share your experience in the comments section below and subscribe to Verified Fears for more real-life horror tales that will challenge your preconceived notions about reality. Jake. Truck driver Jake had been driving 4 hours, his thoughts alternating between fatigue and the mesmerizing rhythm of the road. The night was unusually quiet, with the moon creating eerie shadows across the desolate landscape. The only sounds in his cab were the steady hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of his CB radio. Jake had driven this route innumerable times during his 15-year career as a long-haul trucker, but tonight felt different. There was an oppressive weight in the air, a sense of anticipation that made the vast expanse of nothingness in the Nevada desert punctuated only by the occasional Joshua Tree or abandoned gas station. Jake took pride in his professionalism and punctuality, never missing a delivery deadline and always keeping his equipment in perfect condition. His rig was his livelihood, and his cargo hold was full of electronics headed for Los Angeles. Routine run that should have been completed without incident. Livelihood, his second home, and he treated it with the deference it merited. The CB radio had been silent for the majority of the night, save for the occasional trucker who would tune in to provide weather or road conditions updates. Jake liked the solitude of late-night drives, finding solace in the steady hum of the diesel engine. The never-ending strip of asphalt in front of his headlights abruptly changed, and a voice screamed for assistance. It was his own voice, and it was scared and desperate. Jake's heart raced as he struggled to answer the radio, but the voice kept describing landmarks. Jake Morrison is on eastbound I-80 mile marker 247. My truck has been hijacked, and I'm trapped in the sleeper compartment. They have some sort of chemical cargo that's leaking, and I can smell it burning my lungs. Please, someone, help me before they return. Jake's hands trembled as he reached the destination. The voice was obviously his own, with the same Midwest accent he'd never been able to remove despite living in Nevada for more than 10 years, and the faint rasp from years of smoking. For the microphone, mile marker 247 was still 50 miles ahead of his current position, and he was transporting electronics rather than chemicals. The men who took my truck are not human. I could see their faces when they believed I was unconscious. This is Jake Morrison. He spoke into the microphone, his voice trembling. I'm hearing my own transmission, but I'm not in distress. The radio crackled with static, but his other voice went on, as if he hadn't said anything at all. They kept talking about a harvest and gathering something from the cargo, and their eyes were completely black. God help me. I think they're returning. Jake pulled over to the shoulder, his whole body trembling. and he checked his mirrors, looking around the desert for any indication of another. Jake was confused and afraid, and he tried to dismiss the feeling by telling himself it was a prank or some sort of interference. But the voice kept pleading for someone to find his body before they returned. The highway was empty in both directions, lit only by the pale moonlight and his truck's running lights. They described a rest stop with a broken neon sign in the shape of a cactus, a water tower painted with faded advertisements for a long-gone motor oil firm, and a mile marker that had been defaced with odd symbols. The details were incredibly detailed. "Listen to me, whomever is out there." Through the static, another voice begged, "Don't trust the dispatcher. Olivia has been replaced. The real Olivia had a scar on her left hand from an accident when she was younger. This one doesn't. They are infiltrating the trucking companies and using our routes for something horrible. The cargo manifests are all false. We're not hauling what we believe. We're hauling Jake's blood." When he had last visited the depot, he had noticed that Olivia, his dispatcher, had a scar on her left hand from a childhood accident involving a broken bottle. However, how could his other voice know such personal information about the people in his life? The transmission abruptly ended, leaving Jake in a suffocating silence. For almost an hour, he waited for the voice to return in his cab, but all he could hear was the usual trucker conversation about the weather and fuel prices. No one seemed to have heard the upsetting transmission that had completely rocked Jake. Eventually, Jake forced himself to drive on, but he was unable to sleep, because every shadow seemed to conceal possibilities. He drove through the night in a state of hypervigilance, constantly checking his mirrors and scanning the horizon for any sign of danger. Over the next few days, Jake's life descended into a nightmare. He called the Nevada State Police to report the threats, believing that every oncoming vehicle might be the mysterious hijackers his other voice had described. The dispatcher insisted that all of their fleet's drivers were accounted for and that no cargo had been reported stolen or hijacked. But Jake couldn't get rid of the unsettling feeling that something was seriously amiss. He started looking up the landmarks his other voice had mentioned using trucks after reporting the strange transmission, but they couldn't find any records of any distress calls or missing truckers that fit his description. Stopped computers and his smartphone to look for pictures of rest stops with neon signs shaped like cacti and water towers with old ads. To his dismay, he discovered that these were actual places spread throughout the southwestern United States that he had never been to, that could vividly describe because of his other voice's desperate transmissions. When Jake drove east on Interstate 80 to Mile Arca 247, police discovered an abandoned truck that fit his description at the precise location his other self had provided, but the vehicle identification number didn't match any trucks in the system. The cargo hold was empty, save for Jake was still alive and driving, despite the unusual chemical burns on the metal walls and floor that appeared to be caused by something corrosive having been stored there. He was still troubled by the voice that reverberated through the static every night at 3:17 to dawn. The frequency and level of detail of the transmissions increased. They're using the trucks to transport something that shouldn't exist. His other voice clarified during one especially lucid transmission. The cargo looks normal on the manifests, but it's alive, it moves. When you're not looking directly at it, it whispers in, describing a parallel existence in which Jake had been, a victim of forces beyond his comprehension. Languages that are difficult to hear and are gradually altering the drivers. Jake saw that his fellow truckers had changed. Drivers he had known for years appeared different. Their eyes had a glassy, distant look, and they spoke in monotone voices about their origins and belongings when he attempted to have a normal conversation with them about their families or hobbies. They would just stare at him blankly before apologizing. Jake's paranoia took over, and he began sleeping in his cab in isolated places where he could see people coming from miles away. His sleep became restless and interrupted by nightmares. of faceless men with black eyes and melting skin. He added more locks to his doors and started keeping a baseball bat close at hand. As the story progresses, Jake comes across odd occurrences on the road, including lights that seem to be hovering over the highway that pursued his truck 4 miles, before vanishing shadowy figures standing still by the road who turn to watch him go by, and an increasing feeling that he is being watched by invisible people cause Jake's sanity to deteriorate as he attempts to understand the mystery of the transmission and the evil forces that appear to be pursuing him. The tipping point was when Jake got to the address directed him to a large industrial complex on the outskirts of Las Vegas, a site encircled by high gates and surveillance cameras. His dispatcher Olivia called and asked him to pick up an urgent cargo shipment from a warehouse he had never heard of. The contents of the cargo manifest were specified. The cargo containers were sealed with locks that seemed to pulse with their own internal light, and Jake could swear he heard something moving inside them as they were loaded onto his trailer. However, when he arrived at the loading dock, the workers moved with the same glassy-eyed deficiency he had observed in other truckers. "You don't need to know what's inside," the worker said in a voice that sounded like grinding metal. Jake tried to examine the manifest more thoroughly, but one of the workers grabbed his wrist with unnatural strength, leaving him with bruises that lasted 4 weeks. "Just drive to the destination and don't stop for anything. Don't open the cargo. Hold, don't listen to the radio, and don't look in your mirrors after midnight." Jake wanted to refuse the shipment, but he couldn't move or speak. It felt like his body wasn't in control anymore, and he watched helplessly as his feet carried him back and his hands signed the delivery paperwork. He didn't regain control of his actions until he was many miles away from the warehouse. That night, at precisely 3:17 a.m., his other voice came back with a message that made him feel extremely cold. "Jake, if you're listening to this, then they've reached you as well. The cargo you are transporting consists of thousands of eggs, not medical supplies, and they are about to hatch. You have about 6 hours before they emerge from their containers and begin searching for hosts, so you need to move that truck as far away from populated areas as you can and figure out how to destroy it before it's too late. Don't open them." Jake's other voice screamed as he pulled over late and ran to the back of his trailer, his hands shaking as he struggled with the lock. The containers felt warm to the touch and seemed to pulse with a rhythmic heartbeat. He could hear a wet sliding sound through the metal walls, like something big moving through thick liquid. "Drive to the coordinates I'm about to give you. There's an old mining pit full of acid runoff. That's the only thing that can destroy them. If you open them now, they'll imprint on you, making you their first host. They'll then use your body to spread to others." Jake followed the coordinates to an abandoned copper mine deep in the Nevada desert that had been closed for decades because of environmental contamination. The pit was filled with a toxic soup of chemicals that glowed in the moonlight with an unsettling green phosphorescence. Jake backed his trailer to the edge of the pit and started unhitching it, his hands working frantically as strange noises came from the cargo containers. As he let go of the last coupling, the containers exploded like glass, revealing incomprehensible masses of translucent flesh adorned with rows of sharp teeth that moved with a fluid grace that suggested intelligence far beyond anything found on Earth. Jake's death screams could be heard over the roar of his diesel engine, and they started looking for him right away. Their movements became more coordinated as they communicated through subsonic vibrations that made his bones hurt. Jake dove into his cab and gunned the engine, watching in his mirrors as the trailer and its terrible cargo fell into the acid pit. Jake's relief was fleeting, though, as his radio came to life again as he drove away from the mining hole. The pit bubbled and hissed as the acid consumed the alien spawn, sending up clouds of toxic vapor that shone against the night sky. His other voice said, "You did well, Jake," but now it sounded different, colder and more mechanical. However, that was only the first shipment. Dozens of other trucks are transporting the same cargo to cities all over the nation, and now that you've shown that you can handle the truth, you're going to assist us in stopping them. Jake realizes that he might not be the real Jake Morrison at all, but rather a replica made by the same forces that had replaced his dispatcher and fellow truckers. The story explores themes of identity, fate, and the thin line separating reality from nightmare. The midnight radio transmissions weren't, as dawn broke over the Nevada desert, Jake Morrison, or the entity that thought it was Jake Morrison, continued to drive toward his next destination. This was from a different version of himself, but it was the real Jake Morrison, trapped in a parallel dimension, desperately trying to warn his replacement about the invasion occurring in their reality. The real Jake Morrison's voice continued as he arrived at his location with commands that had been implanted into his synthetic memories. Behind him, the acid pit was still bubbling in smoke, but something had made it through the chemical bath and was already starting to regenerate in order to adapt and evolve. The highways of America had become conduits for an invasion that most people would never see coming, carried out by drivers who no longer remembered being human and cargo that defied every law of nature, to reverberate through the static, which grew fainter with each transmission as the barriers between dimensions gradually crumbled and the harvest started in earnest. Some transmissions are more than just radio interference. They are warnings from those who came before you, desperate messages from the gaps between realities where the original Jake Morrison and others lived. And if you have ever heard the road whisper secrets in the dead of night, or heard your own voice calling for help from places you have never been, you know that as we move on to our second story, the sun had already set behind Tennessee's undulating hills when James pulled his 18-wheeler into the gravel lot of the Mountain View Rest Area. After 14 hours of driving through the area, innumerable others wait in the static, the hopes that someone will hear their cries and comprehend the terrible truth about what travels our highways after midnight. His eyes burned and his body ached from the stress of negotiating the dangerous turns that wound through the Appalachian foothills. The rest area was one of those abandoned locations that appeared to have been frozen in time, with rusted trash cans, weathered picnic tables, and a single flickering streetlight that cast long shadows across this particular stop wasn't listed on any official maps or trucking guides, but seasoned drivers whispered about it in CB radio conversations. James, who had been hauling freight for almost 20 years, took pride in knowing every truck stop, rest area, and safe haven between Atlanta and Pittsburgh. Nestled between two steep ridges that blocked out most of the noise from the interstate below, the October air carried the crisp bite of autumn, and James could smell wood smoke drifting down from the area. It was a place where you could park for the night without being bothered by state troopers or lot lizards looking to make a quick buck. Scattered cabins that dot the mountainside in contrast to the busy cities where he made most of his deliveries, where everyone seemed to be in a hurry and nobody had time for a friendly conversation. James had always found comfort in these isolated Appalachian communities where people still lived by the old ways and minded their own business. As he checked tire pressure and as he was securing his load of construction materials headed to a job site in West Virginia, he noticed another car in the lot. A rusty pickup truck with a faded blue paint job and leaves all over its windshield appeared to have been there 4 hours or even days. James was uneasy about the abandoned car, but he wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the way it sat at a strange angle, as though it had been parked quickly, or the fact that one of its doors hung, slightly jarring. Over the years, he had learned to trust his gut, and now they were telling him that something wasn't right about this place. James made the decision to look into it, because he thought maybe someone needed help. In these mountainous areas, where cell phone service was spotty and the closest tow truck might be hours away, breakdowns were common. He had assisted stranded drivers numerous times over the years, and it was an unspoken rule among truckers to help out when they could. The trucking community was like a brotherhood, united by the common experiences of traveling and the knowledge that a kind deed today could be tomorrow's lifeline, called out to the pickup truck. "Hello, anyone in need of assistance?" The truck's interior was empty, but James noticed dark stains on the driver's seat that disturbed the eerie silence, which was only occasionally broken by the rustle of leaves in the evening breeze and the distant hum of interstate traffic. His voice reverberated off the nearby hills, but no one responded. James had seen enough crime scenes in his years of driving to recognize the signs of violence and everything about this, but it looked suspiciously like dried blood. He backed away from the car, his eyes searching the trees for any movement. The shadows seemed deeper now, and every rustle of leaves made him jump. He saw the man standing at the edge of the parking lot, barely visible in the dim light from the flickering street lamp, standing there as the abandoned truck screamed danger. The man was tall and gaunt, wearing what looked like dirty coveralls that hung down from his body. James could not quite make out the man's face in the shadows, but what drew his attention right away was the large pipe wrench he held in his right hand, which was easily 2 feet long and gleamed dully in the pale light. His hair was long and disheveled, hanging in greasy strands around his skeletal frame. The tool appeared heavy and well worn, with dark stains running along its metal surface that James didn't want to consider too much. The man was standing motionless, like a scarecrow, but James could feel his eyes piercing him with such intensity that his skin crawled. The way the figure stood was essentially off. It was too motionless and patient, like a predator waiting for the ideal opportunity to attack. James's first reaction was to offer assistance, assuming the man might be the owner of the abandoned truck and in need of help. "Hey there," he called out, attempting to maintain a calm and cordial tone while saying, "You're having car trouble. I might be able to help." The man didn't answer, didn't even acknowledge James's words, and simply kept staring with those lifeless, icy eyes that seemed to mirror the street light like an animal. The sound of James' own heartbeat thundering in his ears broke the seemingly endless silence. James had a gut feeling that he should return to his truck right away. This wasn't a stranded driver in need of help. Rather, it was something completely different, something dangerous and unpredictable. Other truckers had told him about encounters with unstable people at isolated rest stops. These people lived on the periphery of society and preyed on gullible travelers. "Okay, if you don't need help, I'll just be heading back to my truck," James said, taking a slow step backward. He didn't want to turn away from the man, but he also didn't want to make any abrupt movements that could lead to an attack. That's when the man moved. Without warning, the figure lunged forward at a speed that seemed unthinkable for someone of his apparent age and condition. The pipe wrench was held above his head like a medieval warhammer, and James's military training from his early years kicked in, and he spun around and ran toward his truck with all the speed he could muster. A sound that was part scream and part animal growl escaped his throat. His face, now exposed in the light, was a mask of pure rage and madness, with wild eyes and bared teeth that looked more like fangs than human dental work. The sound of the heavy wrench slicing through the air could be heard even over his own labored breathing. The distance to his truck seemed to go on forever, like something out of a nightmare where you run and run but never seem to get any closer to safety. Behind him, he could hear the man's footsteps pounding against the gravel, and that inhuman howling that made every hair on the back of his neck stand up. Although his legs felt like lead and his lungs burned, James was able to keep moving thanks to the adrenaline pumping through his body. Just as he reached his cap and grasped the door handle, he felt something brush against his back. The wrench was just missing him by a tiny bit. James could feel the man closing in on him. James threw himself into the driver's seat and slammed the door shut, his hands shaking as he fumbled for the lock. Through the window, he could see the man standing just outside, still holding the wrench and staring at him with those awful eyes. But the impact left a significant dent in the metal paneling, a testament to the incredible force behind the blow. As the assailant started beating on the door with the instrument, each blow causing the entire cab to vibrate and spiderweb the safety glass. The attack lasted for what seemed like hours, but was likely just a few minutes, during which the man circled the truck and struck it repeatedly while yelling unintelligibly. James was convinced that the man would eventually smash through one of the windows and drag him out into the darkness, because his hands were shaking so much that he kept missing the ignition switch. Eventually, James was able to start the engine and shift the transmission into gear, but as the truck lurched forward, he noticed that even the distance grew. James could still see the awful figure silhouetted against the streetlight. The man in his rearview mirror was still standing in the parking lot, watching him go. James drove 450 miles without stopping, his heart racing and his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. When he finally felt safe enough to stop at a well-lit truck stop with plenty of other vehicles, the rational part of his mind knew that the man couldn't have kept up with the semi-truck, but the primal fear that had taken hold of him wasn't interested in logic. The roadside looked like a potential threat, and every oncoming vehicle could be the madman somehow following him. The Tennessee State Police received a call from nearby vehicles reporting the incident. The dispatcher listened to James's statement and agreed to send a patrol car to look into the rest area, but James had a bad feeling that they wouldn't find anything. "Sir, could you describe the person who attacked you?" The dispatcher asked James to explain what he had seen. "But how do you characterize someone who appeared to be more of a force of nature than a human?" "He was tall, perhaps 6 feet 2 or 63, with long, oily hair and soiled coveralls, but what really struck him were his eyes." The dispatcher assured James that they would conduct a thorough investigation and suggested that he seek medical attention if he felt the need. But James knew that no doctor could treat what was truly wrong, because they were completely empty, like they were looking into a void. And he moved incorrectly, too quickly, too aggressively, like he wasn't quite human. He carried with him the knowledge that there were predators out there who preyed on unsuspecting victims by lurking in the shadows. 3 hours later, James received a chilling update from the state police, stating that they had located the rest area precisely as he had described it. The truck belonged to Harold Wickham, a 67-year-old man who was reported missing by his family 3 weeks ago. The officer explained, "We found evidence of a struggle inside the vehicle, including blood spatter that suggests foul play, but whoever did this, the truck was empty, and there were dents in the gravel where the struggle had taken place, but there was no sign of the man with the wrench. Is no longer there. The abandoned truck wasn't merely proof of a breakdown. It was a trophy and a reminder that James had most likely come across Harold Wickham's killer, who had been utilizing the isolated rest area as a hunting ground for gullible tourists. Of a successful hunt, officer, you need to check the woods around that rest area," James said urgently. "I have a feeling you're going to find more than just one missing person." The remains of 7 people were later found in shallow graves scattered throughout the surrounding forest during the ensuing investigation. The killer was never apprehended, despite a protracted manhunt that included numerous law enforcement agencies and search teams with tracking dogs. James never drove through Tennessee again without thinking about that night and the man with the wrench, who had come within seconds of becoming another statistic. The victims had made the fatal mistake of stopping at the Mountain View rest area over the previous 2 years. Missing person whose whereabouts would be unknown to his loved ones, the event altered him in ways that were difficult to describe, making him more watchful of his surroundings and less trusting of remote locations that had previously appeared to be safe and tranquil. Occasionally, late at night, while driving through isolated areas, James would catch a glimpse of a figure standing by the side of the road, and the Mountain View rest area was finally closed by the state, and the access road was barricaded. But James' heart would race with the recollection of those icy, dead eyes. He had learned that evil could take many forms, but the most terrible was when it appeared human, but was something quite different. James was certain that somewhere out there, in another forgotten rest area or abandoned truck stop, the man was still waiting, still holding that blood-stained wrench, still looking for the next traveler who would make the mistake. Predators like that knew that wouldn't stop them, so they simply moved on to new hunting grounds, new places where they could wait in the shadows for their next victim. The most upsetting aspect of the incident wasn't the violence or the near-death encounter, but rather the realization that James might not have noticed the danger until it was too late. If he had arrived even 10 minutes earlier or later, parked in a different location, or taken a different route, he was kept awake during those long nights on the road by the distinction between safety and horror because, in the end, the most terrifying monsters aren't those found in urban legends or horror films. Rather, they're the ones who appear to be regular people until they reveal their true nature. And by that time it's when Danny pulled his truck into the Moonlight Truck Plaza just outside of Bakersfield, California. The fog was thick. He had been driving for 16 hours straight, hauling a load of agricultural equipment from Phoenix to Sacramento, and his eyelids felt like sandpaper against his eyes. Normally, it's too late to run. Let's move on to our third story. Those round-the-clock operations, complete with diesel pumps, a diner serving coffee strong enough to wake the dead, and a small convenience store filled with energy drinks and dubious hot dogs, catered to the never-ending flow of long-haul drivers who kept America's supply chains running. Danny had been trucking for 12 years since leaving the army, and he had a sixth sense about people and places that didn't feel right. He was already exceeding the legal limits of his driving time, and tonight that sense was screaming at him. But fatigue overrode caution. One more infraction would result in the loss of his commercial license, and at 43 with 2 college-age children, he couldn't afford to lose his job. The truck plaza was busier than usual. Danny found a spot near the back, away from the main building, but close enough to the security lights to feel reasonably safe on a Tuesday night, when there were at least a dozen large rigs strewn across the parking lot, like sleeping giants. Over the years, he had discovered that the best parking spots were those that offered multiple escape routes, while maintaining good visibility of the surrounding area. As he turned off his engine and started his post-trip routine, upon closer inspection, Danny saw 2 figures standing close to the edge of the parking lot, partially obscured by the shadows created by a broken streetlight. At first glance, it seemed as though they were conversing, but something about their body language caught his attention as strange. They were standing too close to one another, and their movements were too coordinated, like those of dancers. Danny could see the man's hands moving in odd repetitive motions even from a distance as he performed a choreographed dance. The first figure was a man in his 60s, dressed in a soiled mechanic's jumpsuit that had seen better days. His grey hair was slicked back with what appeared to be motor oil. Danny attempted to ignore them, concentrating instead on verifying his trailer connections and securing his load. But as he worked, he became more conscious that the 2 figures were observing him. The second figure was difficult to identify because it was shorter and wore what looked to be a long coat or dress that hung loosely on a skeletal frame. Although he never actually saw them walking, it seemed like they were drifting across the asphalt, defying the laws of physics and movement every time he looked in their direction. The temperature had dropped considerably since sunset, and D's breath created tiny clouds in the chilly air as he completed his inspection. When he walked around to the driver's side of his cab, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Someone had been rubbing something on the side of his trailer, and it looked like grease or oil. He was excited to get into his sleeper compartment and get some much-needed rest before the final push to Sacramento in the morning. The marks created a pattern that hurt D's eyes to look at directly, with geometric shapes that seemed to fold in on themselves, creating optical illusions that made his head spin. It also had an iridescent quality that seemed to shift and shimmer in the artificial light. The smell was indescribable, resembling rotting meat mixed with ozone and something else that made him think of the flooded cellar of his grandma. "Hey, what the hell are you doing to my truck?" Danny yelled at the two guys, his voice resonating throughout the parking lot. Without making eye contact, the man in the jumpsuit started to approach Danny with a gait that was in some ways both casual and predatory. His partner followed, and as she moved, the man's smile revealed teeth that were too white and pointed for any human lips. Danny backed toward his cab, his hand automatically going to the pistol he kept in his door panel. In all his years on the road, he had never had to draw his weapon, but he had always known that day might come. He saw into the light that what he had thought was a coat was actually her skin, pale translucent flesh that hung in loose folds around her gaunt frame. "You met a wide range of people while working as a truck driver, and not all of them were pleasant," the man said. "Now hold on there, friend," in an accent Danny couldn't understand. "We're only attempting to assist you. We're attempting to purify the negative energy surrounding the rig for you." Danny locked the door and got into his cab, but he could see two figures approaching in his mirrors. The woman, if she was who she was, had moved to the passenger side and was now standing on his step, pressing her face against the window. Her smile caused her breath to fog the glass. The man leapt up on the driver's side step and started licking the window with a tongue that was excessively long and covered in what appeared to be tiny barbs. His eyes never left Danny's face while he performed this hideous act, and Danny could hear him cooing softly like a dove. His teeth looked like they had been filed to points, and his gums were black with decay. "We just want to talk to you about your cargo. We know what you're really hauling, and we can help you dispose of it properly. Open up, driver," the woman replied, her voice muffled by the glass, but still audible. Danny's cargo tractors, plows, and irrigation systems headed for Central Valley Farms were listed on the manifest, but as she talked, he started to recall odd details about the loading procedure that he had previously discounted. The warehouse staff had been unusually covert, covering the equipment with tarps and preventing him from inspecting it. The load the shipping company had paid him in cash ahead of the customary electronic transfer, and the paperwork had been hurried. The truck rocked as both figures began beating on the windows with increasing force. The man was smearing blood on the glass with his fists, and the woman was using hers. "Let us in," the man screamed, his voice rising to an inhuman pitch. "We know you can hear them calling. The cargo is alive, and it wants to come home." The sound of metal on glass was deafening in the cramped cab, and Danny was sure they would break through at any moment. The man had produced what appeared to be a crowbar from somewhere in his jumpsuit. As though drawn by his words, Danny started to hear sounds emanating from his trailer, including what sounded like whispered talks in a language he didn't understand and scraping sounds like fingernails on metal. The trailer started to sway a little as if Danny struggled for his keys, his hands shaking so much that he could hardly hold them, as something big was moving inside of it. The engine overturned on the third attempt, and he threw the transmission into gear without bothering to warm up the diesel. As the truck lurched forward, he watched the man lose his hold and fall to the asphalt. She rode beside the cab for almost a quarter mile, her face pressed against the passenger window, her mouth moving in what appeared to be a silent chant. Her eyes turned completely black, and Danny could see his own reflection multiplied dozens of times in the cab's smooth metal door frame. But the woman managed to hold on somehow. 4 miles down the highway, Danny drove without stopping until he reached Sacramento, his heart thumping and his shirt soaked with sweat despite the cold night air. In the end, she let go and fell into the darkness behind him, but her laughter followed the truck. When he finally reached the delivery site, he was shocked to find that the shipping company denied any knowledge of the missing cargo, and the insurance investigation revealed nothing. The Phoenix warehouse had been abandoned for months. According to local authorities, the agricultural equipment that had been loaded in Phoenix was gone, leaving only odd burn marks on the trailer floor and the lingering smell of ozone and decay. But the most unsettling part came weeks later, when Danny was watching the evening news and saw a report about a series of disappearances in small farming communities throughout the central United States. He was left with an empty trailer, a damaged truck, and memories that no one would believe. And the paperwork he had signed contained the names of people who didn't exist. Valley whole families had disappeared overnight, leaving behind only deserted fields and empty houses that had been cleared of all vegetation. The reporter reported that witnesses had reported seeing strange lights moving through the affected areas while hearing unidentifiable noises. Danny was certain that whatever he had delivered it directly into the center of California's agricultural region, where it could spread and multiply among the remote farms and rural communities. The woman and her companion had not been attempting to rob him. Rather, they had been attempting to prevent something far worse from reaching its destination. Danny had learned to avoid certain routes, truck stops, and shipping companies that paid too much for jobs that seemed too simple, because he now realized that not all cargo was what it seemed. However, occasionally late at night, when he was driving through farming areas, he would see lights moving through the fields and hear sounds that brought back memories of that horrible night at the Moonlight Truck Plaza. Appeared to be, and not every delivery was intended for a human recipients. Some loads were for creatures that used the extensive network of the trucking industry to expand their influence throughout the continent, and somewhere out there was the woman with the translucent skin and her companion. They were the last line of defense against an invasion that most people would never see coming, fighting a war that would never make the evening news. Danny never took another cash job after that night, and he always personally inspected his cargo before leaving the area. They were still waiting and trying to intercept shipments that should never have reached their destinations, loading dock, but he was aware that his attention to detail would not be sufficient, because the enemy had figured out how to blend in with society's infrastructure to spread their corruption throughout the country. The highway never sleeps, and neither do the things that use it to travel between worlds. Let's move on to the fourth story. Rick's Peterbilt's headlights pierced the pre-dawn darkness as he drove through rural Montana on a meandering two-lane highway. It was 4:30 a.m. of a Tuesday in late September, and the only sound in the world was the steady rumble of his diesel engine. Rick had been driving this route for 8 years, transporting lumber from Missoula mills to construction sites in Denver, and he knew every curve, hill, and mile marker by heart. The portion of highway he was currently traveling was especially barren, with 30 meters of asphalt slicing through dense pine forests and rolling meadows with no vegetation. The occasional deer would dart across the road like grey phantoms. Rick preferred these desolate highways over the congested interstates where you had to constantly watch for hostile drivers, because they were the kind of roads where you could drive 4 hours without seeing another car, and the silence was so complete that it felt like a physical weight pressing against your eardrums. Towns without gas stations and cell phone coverage, he had learned to enjoy the solitude, using the quiet hours to reflect on his life, his family, and his plans for retirement in a few years. However, tonight felt different in some way. Out here, the only dangers were wildlife, weather, and the occasional drunk driver weaving home from a bar in some forgotten town. The forest seemed darker than usual, the shadows between the trees deeper and more impenetrable, and even the wildlife was acting strangely. Rick had noticed several deer standing still beside the road, their eyes unmoving, and there was a sense of anticipation in the air that made the hair on his arms stand up. Rick was about 15 miles from the closest town when he noticed something in the road ahead that caused him to slow down and lean forward in his seat. At first, he thought it might be another deer, but as his headlights made the object more visible, he realized it was something much more unsettling. What looked like a human body was spread out over both lanes of the highway. Rick's military training from his youth kicked in, and he started looking around for possible threats, while also slowing down his rig. Ambushes were uncommon on American highways, but they were not unheard of, and the remote when he reached for his CB radio to call for assistance. He realized that he was in a dead zone where no signals could reach. As he approached, Rick noticed that the figure was lying face down in an unusual position, with arms and legs splayed at strange angles that suggested either serious injury or death. Rick stopped his truck approximately 50 feet from the body, leaving his engine running and his headlights focused on the scene. He took his flashlight and his pistol from the door panel and then got out of the cab to investigate. He seemed to be wearing dark clothing, possibly jeans and a jacket, but it was hard to see details in the harsh glare of his headlights. Rick yelled out as he walked up to the figure, "Hello, are you okay? Do you need help?" The night air was cold and still smelled of pine needles and something else, a metallic fragrance that made him think of blood. There was no answer, no movement, no sign of life. Rick tried to get a better look at what he was dealing with by moving closer, his flashlight beam dancing across the asphalt. The closer he got, the more incorrect everything appeared to be. The body was positioned to purposefully, as if someone had placed it for maximum visual impact. The limbs were spread out in a pattern that, even though the person appeared to have suffered severe trauma, it almost looked ritualistic, and there were no skid marks on the road that would indicate a car accident. What's more unsettling is that Rick was only 10 feet away when he stopped and swept his flashlight beam over the entire scene in an attempt to comprehend what he was seeing. The figure was unquestionably human, but something about its proportions seemed strange. The head was angled, the limbs were too thin, and the torso was too long, and that's when he noticed the smell. It wasn't blood after all, but something much worse. The sickly sweet smell of the body had been there 4 days or weeks, but somehow it looked fresh, as if death had just happened hours ago. Rick retreated from the scene, his instincts screaming that this was some sort of trap. The advanced decomposition was combined with chemicals that burned his nostrils and made his eyes water. As he retreated toward his truck, Rick heard a sound that made his blood freeze, a wet sliding noise like something large. Other truckers had told him about bodies being used as bait to stop vehicles, so that criminals could rob or carjack unsuspecting drivers. But this felt different, more calculated, and more sinister than a simple highway robbery. Rick ran back to his cab, locked the doors, and grabbed his CB radio, even though he knew he was moving across the asphalt. He spun around his flashlight beam, sweeping across the road, but the body was exactly where he'd left it. The sound came closer this time, accompanied by what sounded like labored breathing. "Mayday, mayday. This is eastbound on highway 200 mile marker 47. Have a potential fatality in the roadway, and I need quick assistance." He attempted calling for aid in a dead zone nevertheless, broadcasting on the emergency channel, and hoped that someone anywhere could pick up his signal. Rick was totally alone with whatever was going on outside his truck when the radio crackled with static and no one answered. He turned to look back at the body and noticed something that made him doubt his sanity. The figure was not moving like a living thing. When the face appeared, Rick realized it wasn't human at all. The features were incorrectly sharp and angular, and the eyes reflected his gaze. The person was attempting to stand up, but it felt like something was being pulled or controlled by an invisible force. The limbs jerked and twitched in strange ways, and the head started to slowly turn toward his truck. Animal-like headlights, an open mouth that might have been a scream, exposing rows of sharp teeth that belonged in the mouth of a deep-sea predator rather than a person, and waxy, artificial skin that seemed like a mask or prosthetic meant to deceive onlookers. It stood, almost 7 feet tall, its limbs elongated and twisted, its head cocked at an impossible angle as it studied Rick's body, and it started to move with increasing coordination, first pushing itself up on its arms, and then rising to its feet with a fluid grace that defied the laws of anatomy. In his mirrors, Rick saw the thing watching him go, standing there in the center of the highway like a scarecrow. Rick pushed his gearbox into gear and floored the accelerator, causing his truck to lurch forward as the diesel engine roared to life. However, Rick became increasingly alarmed as he realized that the thing was pursuing him. It didn't run or walk. Instead, it just drew nearer to his truck with each glance in the mirror, covering impossibly long distances in an instant. The creature's movements had the stuttering stop-motion quality of missing frames. The chase continued for miles as the creature continued its impossible pursuit, while Rick pushed his truck to its mechanical limits. From an old movie reel, it would be a quarter of a mile behind him 1 minute, then only a few hundred yards away the next, gaining ground despite Rick's 70 miles per hour speed. Rick didn't dare slow down when the engine temperature gauge rose dangerously high and he could smell burning oil and overheated metal, but the thing that had posed as a human corpse continued to advance relentlessly behind him, its glowing eyes never leaving his truck. Just as he thought his engine was going to die, he crested a hill and saw as soon as his truck passed the town limits, the creature disappeared. Rick pulled into the parking lot of an all-night diner and sat in his cab for almost an hour, shaking and trying to comprehend what had happened. The lights of a small town spread out in the valley below. The sight of civilization gave him hope, and he started laying on his horn and flashing his headlights in an attempt to wake anyone who might be able to help him. The local sheriff's department sent a deputy to take Rick's statement after he finally summoned the courage to do so. However, the officer was obviously convinced that Rick was either intoxicated or experiencing hallucinations from too many hours of driving. "Sir, we get calls like this maybe once or twice a year." The deputy explained patiently. Long-haul drivers isolated highways, but Rick knew what he had seen, and that it wasn't a hallucination. The following day, he drove back to mile marker 47 with a state trooper, but they found nothing with no body. Sleep deprivation is a surefire way to see things that aren't there. Why don't you get some rest and see how you feel in the morning? There is no shame in it. It happens to the best of us. Rick never drove that section of highway again, opting instead to take a longer route. There was no indication of any disturbance, just an empty highway winding through the forest. The trooper was understanding but firm. Sometimes the mind plays tricks on us, especially when we're exhausted and stressed. Route that prolonged his journey by 2 hours, but kept him on more crowded roads with better cell phone coverage. But he couldn't get rid of the uneasy feeling that the creature was still out there, hunting for victims on remote highways. Over the next few months, Rick started looking into similar incidents and discovered a troubling trend. The majority of truckers' reports of seeing bodies in the road that were actually something else entirely, things that used human appearance as camouflage to trick unwary drivers into stopping, were written off as hallucinations or hoaxes. But Rick already knew that the creatures were real. Rick began carrying more weapons in his truck and added more lighting and communication equipment, because they knew that most people would stop to help someone who looked injured. They used the highway system in America as their hunting ground, because they were well versed in human psychology. He also started telling other drivers about the risks of stopping for bodies on the road, particularly on remote highways where assistance was far away. While some truckers paid attention, the majority disregarded his warnings as the ramblings of a man who had driven too long, because they couldn't believe that there were things out there that appeared human but weren't predators, that had learned to imitate our appearance and take advantage of our instincts for their own sinister ends. But Rick was aware of the truth and always carried it with him when he got into his taxi and drove down the highway, somewhere in the shadows between the cities and the safe harbors of civilization. There were things that were waiting that were beyond explanation and contradicted everything we, as Michael drove his Kenworth through the darkness, carrying a load of industrial machinery from Detroit to Seattle. It was almost 2 in the morning. The road was full of dangers that no driving manual could prepare you for, and the most terrifying ones were the ones that looked like they needed help. Let's move on to our fifth story. The temperature had dropped to 15 degrees below zero on a moonless Thursday night in February. It was the kind of cold that could kill you in a matter of minutes if your truck broke down in the wrong place, the kind that caused the metal of your rig to compress and groan like a living thing in misery. Michael had been the Wyoming section of Interstate 80, was notorious for unexpected blizzards that could turn a routine drive into a life-threatening situation. He had been a professional driver for 23 years and had learned to respect the power of winter weather in the mountain states. He kept extra blankets, emergency food, and a satellite phone in his cab, along with enough diesel fuel to run his engine 4 days if he got stranded. The weather was clear tonight, but it was extremely cold, with stars strewn across the sky like shattered glass. The highway stretched in front of his headlights 4 miles, a ribbon of asphalt slicing through a landscape so barren that it could have easily been the surface of another planet. Michael had traveled this route hundreds of times, mile after mile of nothing but sagebrush wind and the occasional antelope herd moving like ghosts through the darkness, however, never failed to impress him. He was about 40 miles east of Laram when his CB radio crackled to life with a transmission that made him sit up straighter in his seat. The voice was that of a young, female, and terrified person. "I'm stuck in a truck at mile marker 235, and he's coming back, so I don't think I can hide much longer. If anyone can hear this, please call the police." Michael quickly grabbed his microphone and replied, "This is eastbound on I-80, and I copied your message. I don't know precisely where I am. I was hitchhiking, and this trucker took me up, but something's wrong with him. He's not helping. Transmission, what's your location, and what sort of aid do you need?" The radio went silent for a long time, and then the woman's voice came back, even more terrified than before. "He's not normal. I was able to lock myself in the sleeper compartment, but he knows I'm in here." Michael pushed the accelerator, pushing his truck faster than was safe on the icy highway while attempting to keep radio contact with a terrified person. He checked his GPS and saw that the mile marker to 135 was still 15 miles ahead of his current position. "Lady miss, what's your name?" "My name is Michael, and I'm on my way to you right now." "Could you tell me more about the truck you're in?" "My name is Sarah," said the voice. "It's a blue Peterbilt with flames painted on the sides." The driver sighed, but when I looked at his logbook, I saw that his name was actually Carl. His eyes, God, were completely black, no whites or pupils, and Michael felt cold for no apparent reason. The black eyes were a novel detail that suggested this situation was much worse than a simple predatory situation. He had heard stories from other truckers about drivers who weren't quite right, people who preyed on vulnerable hitchhikers and stranded motorists using the anonymity of the highway. Michael reached for his satellite phone and dialed 911, but the call wouldn't go through because the display showed no signal, which was impossible. Satellite phones were made to work. "I need you to remain calm and keep that door locked. I'll be there in about 10 minutes. And I'm calling the state police right now. This is eastbound I-80 at mile marker to 120. And I have a female in distress at marker to 135 who is requesting immediate assistance from any units in the area." He tried again, but the same thing happened, so he switched to his CB radio to call for help from other truckers. However, there was no response. It seemed as though all of his truck's communication devices had abruptly stopped functioning, cutting him off from the outside world. Sarah's voice came back more frantic than before. "And he's back and attempting to enter the sleeper. Oh no, he's not using the door handle. Instead, he's doing something to the metal, which is bending as though it's made of in the background of Sarah's transmission." Michael could hear sounds that were unlike anything he had ever heard. A low humming noise that sounded like an electrical transformer, along with what sounded like metal being twisted and reshaped. The sounds were both mechanical and organic, as though the truck itself were changing due to an impossibly strong force. There's a crowbar underneath the bunk, but I doubt it would help Michael, because this thing isn't human. I can see its shadow through the curtain, and it's tall and thin, and it smells like burning copper. Sarah, can you see anything? Is there a weapon in the sleeper that you can use to defend yourself? Rotting meat. Michael climbed a hill and noticed lights in the distance. A truck was parked on the highway shoulder, its danger lights blinking. As he approached, he realized it was the blue Peterbilt with flame decals that Sarah had described, resting at an unnatural angle, as though it had, despite the fact that there was no wind strong enough to move a loaded semi-truck. The trailer behind the cab was swaying back and forth. The truck had been abandoned in a hurry, but something was wrong with its appearance. The metal seemed to be moving, rippling like water, and the flames painted on the sides looked like they were actually burning, casting flickering shadows across the snow-covered ground. The trucking life exposed due to a variety of dangers, some of which couldn't be handled with words or common sense. Sarah, I'm here. I can see the truck I'm in. Michael stopped his truck about 100 yards away and retrieved his shotgun from behind his seat. He had never had to use it in all his years on the road, but he always knew this day might come. Michael watched as the blue Peterbilt started to change more dramatically. Sarah's voice screamed over the radio, "Don't come closer. It's not just the driver. The entire truck is wrong. It's alive somehow, and it's hungry. I can feel it trying to get inside my head to make me open the door." On an organic quality that made his stomach turn, the thing that had been posing as a truck turned toward Michael's position. What had once been chrome exhaust stacks were now writhing like tentacles, and the windshield had changed into a cluster of black eyes that reflected his headlights with malevolent intelligence. And he saw that the grille had changed into a mouth, with rows of metal teeth. The headlights pulsed in a rhythm that made him think of a heartbeat, and the diesel engine's rumble had changed to something more like a growl. "Sarah, where are you in that thing? I need to know exactly where you are so I can get you out." "I'm in the sleeper compartment, but it's Michael. I don't think this is a truck at all. I think it's something that looks like a truck to trick people into getting close. The walls are getting softer, and I can feel them pressing in on me." Michael came to the horrifying realization that Sarah was correct. The creature had developed the ideal camouflage for hunting on American highways. The creature started to approach Michael's truck, not rolling on wheels, but flowing across the asphalt like a huge slug. It looked like a typical scimitar with a human driver, enabling it to pick up hitchhikers and stranded drivers without raising suspicion. By the time victims realized what they were dealing with, they were already trapped inside its body. Michael put his truck in reverse and started to back away, but the creature was faster than it appeared. Tentacles sprang out from its body and wrapped around his front as more tentacles emerged from what had been the trailer, and bioluminescent patterns appeared along its sides like the markings of a deep-sea predator. As the creature's digestive processes started to work on the sleeper compartment where Sarah was trapped, he could hear her screaming over the radio, "Michael, helped me, and it's dissolving the walls. I can see outside, but it looks like I'm inside a stomach." Michael pressed the accelerator, his truck's engine straining against the creature's grip, and the tentacles stretched. The creature writhed in what may have been pain or rage, its disguise completely abandoned as it revealed its true form in his mirrors. It was enormous, easily the size of a city bus, with a body that seemed to be part machine and part human, but finally snapped under the stress, allowing him to break free. Its surface was covered in what appeared to be license plates from dozens of different states, trophies from past victims who had made the fatal mistake of accepting a ride. Cables and wires hung from its underside like intestines, sparking and twitching with electrical current. Michael drove for 20 miles before his communication equipment started working again, and he called 911 right away to report what he had seen. Despite his skepticism, the dispatcher consented to send a patrol car to look into the scene of his encounter with the creature. When the state police reached mile marker 235, they discovered an empty highway that stretched through the Wyoming wilderness with no truck and no signs of any disturbance. The official report listed Michael began looking into similar incidents and discovered a troubling pattern of missing hitchhikers and unexplained disappearances along major trucking routes. He called this a possible hallucination caused by exhaustion and loneliness, but he knew what he had seen, and that Sarah was still out there somewhere trapped inside a creature that used the highway system, its hunting ground. Using CB radio chatter and appropriate documentation, the creature had learned to mimic not only the appearance of a truck, but also the behavior patterns of professional drivers. Most victims were unaware of their danger until it was too late to flee, but Michael began carrying more weapons and alerting others the creature was clever, adaptable, and patient. It could wait years between hunts to perfect its camouflage and study human behavior. He warned truckers about the dangers of picking up hitchhikers, especially on remote highways where help was far away, but he knew that his warnings would only be partially effective. Somewhere on America's highways, a truck that isn't actually a truck, which keeps skulking through the night in search of its next victim. Inside its body, the voices of its past victims reverberate through the static, urging unanswered help and alerting drivers to the dangers that lie beneath the surface of our daily lives. The highway never sleeps, and neither do we. At Murphy's final stop, Tommy pulled his Freightliner into the diesel bay as the neon sign at the gas station flickered erratically in the pre-dawn darkness, casting sporadic red and blue shadows across the parking lot's cracked asphalt. The things that hunt along its endless miles. Let's move on to our sixth story. The digital clock on his dashboard read 3:47 a.m. It was a dilapidated truck stop on the outskirts of nowhere, Nevada, where the desert extended in all directions like a sea of sand and sagebrush. He had been driving since 11 o'clock. Murphy spent long hours transporting a load of electronics from Los Angeles to Salt Lake City, and his final destination was just what its name implied, a last chance to refuel, eat, and relax before heading out onto the most barren stretch of highway in the American West. The building itself appeared to have been built in the 1960s and hadn't been updated since then. It had rusted metal siding, faded paint, and windows so filthy they were almost invisible, but it was open 24 hours a day. The diesel was inexpensive, and the coffee was strong enough to keep a dead man awake. Tommy had been trucking for 15 years after leaving the Marines, and he had come to value these abandoned outposts of civilization. As Tommy filled up his tanks, he saw another truck pull into the lot. It was a newer Peterbilt with California license plates, and the staff knew that drivers needed more than just fuel. They needed a warm meal, a friendly face, and occasionally just someone to talk to during the long, lonely hours of the night. Plates driven by a man who appeared to be around his own age. The driver parked close to the building and entered, accompanied by a somewhat stiff gait. Tommy finished filling up and made the decision to go inside for coffee and the sandwich, possibly. Starting a conversation with a Murphy's final destination was a time capsule of a bygone era, complete with wood-paneled walls, vinyl booths that had seen better decades, and a jukebox that most likely still played 45 PM records. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered and hummed, creating harsh shadows that made everyone appear pale and ill. Another road warrior, a middle-aged woman with graying hair and exhausted eyes, stood behind the counter. She was the type of person who had worked the night shift in places like this for too long. The other trucker was at the coffee station, filling a large styrofoam cup with what appeared to be motor oil. Tommy came up and nodded in greeting, adhering to the unwritten rule of the road that truckers should acknowledge long nights, even though they were strangers. Tommy inquired as he reached for his own cup. The other driver grinned, but something about his face made Tommy shiver. His eyes were also too brilliant. "Every night's a long night out here," he said. "But I don't mind. I enjoy the solitude. The darkness gives me time to think about my work." His smile was intense. Tommy felt uneasy about the way he used the word work, as though it had meanings that went far beyond just moving freight. The man held out his hand to greet him, and Tommy saw that his fingers were unusually long and pale, with nails that resembled claws. "Name's Carl," the stranger said. "I've been on these roads for more years than I'd like to remember." "Wickham." Tommy shook the offered hand and regretted it right once, because Carl's skin was freezing even though the truck stop was warm, and his grip was uncomfortable. The man's palm felt rough and scaly, like the height of some reptilian creature. "When?" Tommy Morrison said. "I'm heading up to Salt Lake U." He pulled his hand back as swiftly as etiquette would permit. Carl's smile deepened, revealing even more. The conversation went on for a few more minutes, but Tommy felt more and more uneasy as Carl continued to speak in riddles and have statements that always seemed to imply more. "Oh, of those abnormally sharp teeth. Oh, I go wherever the road takes me. I'm not particular about destinations. It's the journey that matters." Don't you think the man's eyes took on a predatory gleam when Tommy asked what kind of freight Carl? "Hold. Let's just say I transport things that most people wouldn't want to know about, specialized items for specialized customers." He also mentioned having cargo that required special handling and talked about making deliveries to people who were very particular about their requirements. Tommy excused himself and went to the counter to pay for his coffee, but he could feel Carl's eyes following him across the room. The cashier, whose name tag identified her as Dolores, rang up his purchase with the mechanical efficiency of someone who'd performed "You be careful out there, honey." Dolores murmured softly, looking at Carl. "After performing the same operation hundreds of times, that one has been coming in here for months, always by himself, asking questions about other drivers. Something ain't right about him." Tommy nodded, then made his way to the door, but Carl stopped him close to the exit. "Hey Tommy, I was thinking, we're both going north, and the road can get pretty lonely. Why don't we convoy for a while? Keep each other company over the CB." Tommy's instincts were yelling at him to refuse, but he didn't want to come across as impolite or suspicious. "So I suppose that would be all right. I'm on Channel 19. Carl's smile grew even more eerie. "Perfect. I'll be right behind you, keeping an eye on your back. You never know what kinds of threats you might face in the dark," Tommy said as he left the truck stop. He was doing his pre-trip examination when he observed Carl standing unmoving across the parking lot, watching him like a scarecrow next to his Peterbilt. The man's truck was normal enough from a distance, but something about it seemed off. Tommy got into his cab, eager to get back on the road and put some distance between himself and the strange trucker. But as he pulled out of the parking lot, he noticed Carl's headlights appear in his mirrors, following at a distance that was a little off, and the chrome seemed to gleam with an unnatural brightness in the artificial light. "It's a beautiful night for driving, isn't it? It's so quiet and tranquil that it's ideal for getting to know each other." The CB radio burst to life as Tommy pulled onto the highway. "Hey Tommy boy, this is your new road buddy Carl." "Better." Tommy grudgingly pressed the button on his microphone. "Yeah, it's a wonderful night. Good visibility, light traffic." "Oh, I love light traffic," Carl said, his tone chilling Tommy. "There are fewer witnesses, fewer complications, just the truckers riding alone on the highway sharing stories and experiences." Over the course of the following hour, Carl asked Tommy additional intimate questions about his family, home address, customs, and routine. Tommy attempted to be vague in his answers, but Carl persisted in wanting more information. Could be used for unidentified purposes. "As you are aware, Tommy, I've been considering growing my business, and I am constantly seeking new partners who appreciate discretion. The type of work I do necessitates a particular kind of person, someone who can keep secrets and refrains from asking too many questions." Carl's laughter sounded like cracking glass over the radio as Tommy's anxiety about the cargo increased. By the mile. What precisely do you transport, Carl? You keep mentioning specialized cargo, but you never specify what it is. Let's just say I deliver goods that are highly sought after, but challenging to acquire through traditional means. You could say that they are rare specimens, things that most people have never seen and hopefully never will. As the highway continued through the Nevada desert, Tommy realized he was alone with this strange man for miles. You seem anxious, Tommy. Carl's voice was heard. Your driving is becoming a little erratic. Maybe you should pull over and take a break. The closest town without cell phone coverage and no way to call for help. As things went wrong, Carl's truck kept following at the same distance, its headlights like predatory eyes in Tommy's mirrors. Tommy's hands clenched on the steering wheel. I'm okay, thank you. I want to travel a few more miles before I stop. I know the ideal location up ahead. It's really private and isolated. We could have a face-to-face chat and truly get to know one another. There's a rest area at mile marker 127. You're going to pull over there and we're going to have a little chat about your future. Even though every sensible thought in Tommy's mind told him not to. But I insist, Carl responded. And now his voice had taken on a commanding tone that seemed to bypass Tommy's conscious mind and speak directly to his nervous system. There was a rest area, a small, dimly lit parking lot with a few picnic tables, and a restroom building that appeared to have been neglected for years. Tommy noticed that he was slowing down as he got closer to mile marker 127. It seemed as though his truck was guiding itself toward the exit ramp, as if his hands were no longer in control. Tommy managed to keep his truck on the highway by fighting the urge to grip the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white, but the struggle left him exhausted and trembling. Behind him, Carl's truck had approached, and Tommy could see that the other driver was no longer alone in his cab. There were people moving around inside. Tommy, Carl's voice said, and now it sounded different, deeper, more resonant, as if it were preparing something. Carl's truck had shadowy shapes that didn't look completely human. They appeared to be setting up tools or equipment that Tommy couldn't identify but knew he didn't want to see up close. Came from something much bigger than a human throat. I was hoping we could get this done quickly, but you're going to make me work for it. I love a challenge. Carl's truck suddenly sped up, passing Tommy's rig in the left lane. Tommy could see Carl driving through the passenger window. His eyes now glowed with an inner light that was unquestionably not human, and his skin had taken on a greyish mottled appearance. Most unsettling of all, his mouth had stretched into an impossible wide grin that exposed rows of shark-like teeth. The figures in Carl's passenger seat and their bodies were elongated and twisted, with too many joints in their limbs, and their faces appeared to have been melted and reformed. The sleeper compartment was now clearly visible, and Tommy's mind flinched from what he saw. They weren't human at all, but rather something that might have been human once before being changed into something else entirely. One of the creatures pressed its face against Carl's passenger window and started licking the glass with an excessively long tongue covered in what appeared to be barbs. Its eyes met Tommy's, and Tommy felt it trying to connect with him mentally by piercing the edges of his awareness with tendrils of extraterrestrial thought. Tommy then reached for his CB microphone and started broadcasting on the Mayday Mayday emergency channel. This is eastbound I-80 at mile marker 130. I'm being chased by hostile individuals. I need anyone in the area to help me right away. The radio crackled with static, but no one answered. It seemed like Carl and his friends were somehow blocking all communication channels, preventing Tommy from getting any possible assistance. Carl's truck started to encroach on Tommy's rig, pushing him toward the highway's shoulder. The animals inside were growing more agitated, pressing against the windows and making noises that Tommy could see were a combination of electronic interference and animal growls. Carl's voice, coming through the radio with a quality that caused the speakers to vibrate and distort, said, "You can't run forever, Tommy. using instruments that resembled a cross between medical equipment and torture devices. "We know where you live, where your family lives, your routes, your schedules, and your habits. You're going to stop eventually, and we'll be here when you do." Tommy came to the horrifying realization that this wasn't a chance meeting. Carl and his friends had been following him, observing his habits, and waiting for the ideal moment to attack. The meeting at Murphy's last stop hadn't happened by accident. The creatures in Carl's truck were now working on what appeared to be a huge net or web made of material that seemed to shift and writhe with its own internal movement. Tommy realized that they were getting ready to capture him and drag him into their vehicle, where he would endure unspeakable things. It had been meticulously planned to get Tommy alone on this remote stretch of highway. The highway was elevated here, running along a ridge with steep drop-offs on both sides. Tommy was desperate and started searching for any way out. There were no side roads or exit ramps, so he had no choice but to go straight into whatever trap Carl had set for him. That's when Tommy remembered the runaway truck ramp he'd passed about 5 miles ago. If he could somehow get out of this, Tommy suddenly hit his brakes, causing his truck to decelerate rapidly. Tommy could see the creatures inside scrambling to adjust their positions as Carl's truck sped past him. He might be able to double back and use the ramp to escape into the desert, where the creature's larger vehicle would have trouble following. Tommy immediately floored the accelerator. As the creatures inside Carl's truck prepared their capture equipment, Tommy was able to see more of them, at least 6 or 7 beings that appeared to have been put together from spare parts of different species and started weaving back and forth across both lanes, making it difficult for Carl to match his movements. The chase went on for several more miles. Tommy finally found what he was looking for, an emergency crossover in the highway median that would allow him to reverse direction. Some of them had too many arms, while others had heads that weren't the right shape for their bodies. They all moved with a fluid, boneless quality that suggested their anatomy was fundamentally different from anything terrestrial. He waited until Carl's truck was decided on a passing maneuver, then abruptly crossed the median and started to return the way he had come. Carl's truck attempted to follow, but Tommy watched in his mirrors as the vehicle skidded sideways across the median, almost rolling over before coming to rest in a cloud of dust and debris. Tommy didn't pause to check if Carl and his companions were hurt, so he drove as fast as he could back toward Murphy's final stop in the hopes of finding assistance or at least others who could see what was happening. However, when he got to the truck stop, he discovered it was completely deserted. The doors were locked, the lights were off, and there was no sign of Dolores or anybody else. It seemed as though the entire area had been evacuated in anticipation of whatever. Tommy's predicament became even more dire when he realized that the creatures had accomplices that indicated they were a part of a larger organization. He drove eastward, keeping as far away from the scene of the encounter as he could. His cell phone showed no signal, and his CB radio remained silent. If he had been completely cut off from the outside world, Tommy didn't get a signal on his phone until he got to the Salt Lake City suburbs, at which point he was able to dial 911. The dispatcher took his report seriously and said they would send patrol cars to look into the scene of the encounter, but Tommy knew they wouldn't find anything. Tommy finished his delivery in Salt Lake City, but he couldn't get rid of the feeling that he was still being watched. Carl and his friends were too intelligent and well organized to leave any evidence behind. They would have cleared away any signs of their presence and moved on to stalk their next victim. The highway was full of lone truckers who could vanish for days or weeks without anyone noticing. The creatures were real, and they were using the extensive network of the trucking industry to hunt for victims. He started changing his routes, avoiding the Nevada desert completely, and packing more weapons in his truck. He also started looking into similar incidents and discovered a troubling pattern of missing truckers along remote highways throughout the western United States. Tommy began telling other truckers his story, cautioning them about the risks of accepting convoy invitations, because they knew the road culture well enough to blend in and look normal until they exposed their true nature. Most drivers who came into contact with them most likely never lived to tell about it. From strangers, particularly on remote routes, while some people paid attention, the majority ignored his warnings as the result of excessive driving and coffee consumption. But Tommy was aware of the reality and carried that information with him each time he got into his taxi and went out into the highway between cities. Somewhere in the shadows, Carl and his friends continued to hunt in hopes of finding their next victim. No safety guideline could adequately prepare you for the numerous predators on the road. Before it was too late to flee, the most dangerous ones appeared nearly human, and in the deepest Murphy's last destination in the Nevada desert is deserted and vacant, awaiting the next gullible trucker to pull over for coffee and fuel, unaware that they are entering a trap that has been meticulously set up by entities that shouldn't be there. Both the roadway and the hunters that stalk its unending miles never sleep, mask like human faces as they hunt for their next victim.